Hi everyone, here is part 2 of economic systems for week 10. So where we left off in part 1, we were talking about reciprocity and we'd gone over this. Reciprocity is basically the exchange of goods, and the textbook says it's the exchange of goods of equal value, but it's more complex than that. So we talked specifically, well, we looked at this slide here with the 3 different kinds of reciprocity, and in the last video we ended off, we were talking about generalized reciprocity, which is a kind of reciprocity where that works really well amongst, close family and friends, or very small scale societies where pretty much everybody knows each other. And it's the idea that, people give, everybody gives freely without expectation of immediate return or even of the return of something of equal value. And in this way, everybody winds up benefiting because everybody's giving and everybody's getting, even if person A and person B don't give back and forth between each other directly. So everybody winds up getting what they need. So we'll skip ahead here because this is stuff we've covered. We're going to look at balanced reciprocity. Now, with balanced reciprocity, you do have an expectation that something will be returned from that same person that you gave to, and of something of roughly equal value, but it's not always an immediate exchange. And a really classic example of this in anthropology is the Kula ring. Now, this takes place in an area of Papua New Guinea, and the Kula ring has been documented as this ritual trade of items made of shells. So you have moali, I'm probably not pronouncing it properly, which are white shell armbands, and we'll see what these look like, and sulava, which are red shell necklaces. So what happens, and this is something that primarily happens among men in this region, women have their own kind of parallel kind of exchange. It wasn't as documented because early anthropologists from the West were more interested in what men was doing. That was a male bias in anthropology, but in the meantime, so other anthropologists have learned more about the exchange that women engage in. So, with respect to the Kula ring, these items, so they're decorative, right? They're ornaments. So they're not things that are a necessity for survival. But they have social value, and the value that they have is based on the status of people who've owned them. So these necklaces, and armbands, they never stay with one person forever. They're not a gift forever. It's expected that they keep circulating. So each man has a trading partner on each other island, and so what happens is that we're talking about multiple islands in this area. And so if you live on one, and then you have a trading partner on each of the other islands, and when men from one island go on a trip, they might go, say, clockwise, and then they're distributing one type of ornament to their trading partners on these other islands, and eventually those trading partners will all come to your island either from one direction or from the other, as they're going clockwise or counterclockwise, and they're distributing return gifts to their trade partners, and it's just like kind of this ongoing cycle throughout somebody's life. And the thing is that the length of time between exchanges symbolizes the strength of the relationship. So if you show up and you give somebody a white shell armband and they go run off to wherever they live, and they come back right away with a red shell necklace to give you, that's kind of insulting, because that's it feels like a one-off transaction. It's expected that, maybe it'll take months, maybe years, but eventually something is going to come back to you from that person. So here's a little map of the area. So you have the island of New Guinea here, Papua New Guinea. And so you have these islands in the area, and the direction, the red arrows, so that's counterclockwise. So when people are going counterclockwise around these islands, they're giving away the red shell necklaces. And when they go around clockwise, in the direction of the white arrows, they're giving the white shell armbands. So this, again, it goes on a regular basis, and here are some examples. I'll have to fix that image here. So there's an armband made of white shell and a necklace made with red shell. With not only red shell, you see some white stuff there too. right? It's just the primary part. So what's interesting here is, that this happens. They show up. There's a ritual exchange of these items, and then after that, there's feasting, right? So these are ways that people keep contact, and they engage in ritual and ceremony. And then over the next few days, while people are on that island visiting for this exchange, then they'll trade some actual subsistence items like pigs, rice, yams, canoes, because each island presumably has its own environment. Maybe they have their own skills. Maybe in one place they're really good at building canoes, and so this is something that other people will want to benefit from. Maybe on some of these islands, yams grow better. Yams are quite kind of sweet potato, and so so it's interesting, right? Because they could just show up and just trade this stuff, but no, they engage in ritual exchange first. And usually when we talk about this more, we actually demonstrate these things with little poker chips when we're in class. Same with generalized reciprocity. We demonstrate all this stuff. We can't right now, but we have this discussion too. So why don't they just show up and do their tours among these islands and just engage in straight trade of these things that they actually need to survive? Well, when you think about it, you want to maintain good relations, right? And there's always a potential for conflict in different places in the world. We know this. Human nature is complex. We have conflict, we have allyship, we have peace, we have war. Like all these things coexist among humans. So there's always a risk that people will try to steal from each other, raid each other, things like that. So if they maintain good relations with these ceremonial exchanges and these lifelong ceremonial trading partnerships, they have a better chance of maintaining smooth relations with nobody taking advantage of the others, with nobody going and raiding and being violent with other people. Okay? So when we say that economic systems aren't just about pure survival, they're about human relations too, which is why in the beginning of the first video I was talking about, there's a connection here with social organization. Unlike, economics too, right? Top level economists in the field of economics, they also consider culture and social factors as well. Just it might not trickle down to your intro to economics courses here in CSHAP, but definitely there are connections here. Everything's connected: social structure, social organization, political organization. It's all connected with the ways in which people distribute the things that they need. And again, as we did with generalized reciprocity, we can see that these principles can exist also along with other economies. So even in the society that we all live in right now, and in which a lot of us grew up, this is kind of capitalist system where the primary economic system is a capitalist one, and the market exchange. There's still situations in which people will practice forms of reciprocity, like generalized reciprocity, as we saw, balanced reciprocity here. And one example, you're all old enough to kind of go out to the bar with your friends, and well, maybe some of you haven't had a chance yet since you became old enough to do that because of the pandemic. So before the pandemic, maybe some of you were already, occasionally going out to the bar with your friends. And a thing that happens when people gather at a bar, especially if it's a place where they sell pitchers of beer, people might take turns buying a round of beer, right? So you're 5 or 6 friends or 3 friends or whatever, and you each take turns, ordering a pitcher that everybody shares. Another pitcher comes, somebody else pays, right? And so that's one example where there's this kind of immediate exchange, right? There's an expectation that at the end of the evening, everybody will have paid for one of the rounds. And, with groups of friends who care about each other, people might make an exception for people in the group who are less well off, and it's like, oh no, I'll cover this one kind of thing. But it's kind of an example of this, if you went to the bar with 3 or 4 people and it was always the same person buying all the rounds, there wouldn't be any reciprocity, unless they had pre-negotiated this and the people were doing something else for the person, like buying them a meal or mowing their lawn or something. So that's one example. So if we want to compare, because this is where students get confused a lot, the difference between generalized and balanced reciprocity. Generalized, remember, you're giving without the expectation of immediate return, and the value isn't calculated. Okay, so again, it's this idea, usually this is practiced among a wider group of people. We're not just talking about two people exchanging back and forth. There's a group of people within which, things are given freely, and if everybody practices the mentality, things wind up coming around. And it can be intergenerational as well, where parents or other caretakers are giving to the people that they're raising, and those people grow up to become adults on their own, and then they participate in this kind of economic system as well. And so we saw examples of this with the Johuansi, and also, in capitalist systems, you would still have, some people have this ethic of, I'll just help people who need it, and not expect anything back. Whereas with balanced reciprocity, you are giving with an expectation of a return, not necessarily immediate though, but at a specific time. If you give something to person B, you're definitely expecting that person B will give something directly back to you, and it should be of roughly equal value. Okay? And so examples of this are the value is culturally determined. It's not always determined based on Western ideas of what has value. It's not always monetary value, right? Because with the cooler ring, we see the armbands and the necklaces, they have a social value. It's not necessarily monetary. And the example of taking turns buying a round. So there's a lot of symbolism here, right, with reciprocity, because again, we're talking about this under economic systems, but it's not just about the material value of something in terms of can you eat it, right? As we saw with the cooler ring, it's not about something that you would consume. It's decorative. It's not a survival need, right? But even in cases where the exchanges are about food or shelter, things that, materials to build shelter or clothing, even in those cases, and you can read the beautiful example of the Trobriand Islands in the chapter as well, with the skirts that women make out of banana leaves, and how this has, again, it's not something that they eat, and it's not like they don't have anything else with which to make skirts, so there's a practical value, but it's not necessarily a basic survival need. It's the symbolism, so there's a lot of social symbolism, so it can be, the time between gifts or items that are exchanged, and the value of the items symbolize the nature of relationships. As we said with the cooler ring, if your trading partner comes back 2 hours later and gives you a red shell necklace in exchange for the armband, like, that feels transactional, and the person would be insulted, because it's like, well, no, you don't think this relationship is going to last? So it's a little bit like, imagine if you're in CEGEP now, and maybe you have some friends from high school you kind of stay in touch with, but you're so busy with CEGEP or work or whatever that you don't have time to hang out as much as you used to. And you run into them at the mall sometime, and again, let's imagine we're not in a pandemic. You run into them at a mall, and you're happy to see them, and you both have a little bit of time to spare, so it's like, oh, well, let's go to the Second Cup or Tim's or whatever. Look, I'm going to buy you a coffee, right? And that's great. You catch up, you spend a half hour, an hour, whatever, chatting and catching up. And then your friend says, oh, well, I have to see you tomorrow because I have to pay you back for this coffee. And it will be my turn to buy you coffee, and it has to be tomorrow or sometime this week. It might feel a little bit like, what, this person doesn't trust that I genuinely wanted to buy them a coffee? What's, if you're friends long term, you assume that over the long term, it'll even out, right? Same thing with favors. It's like somebody helps you move, and then they expect you to help them move the next day, or instead of saying, well, in a few years they'll be moving and you'll wind up helping them. Or if you have a bad back and you can't lift boxes, you might help them with something else, right? But it doesn't have to be immediate, because you're friends, and presumably you'll be friends for years to come and have other opportunities. So that's what we're talking about, like the social value of things and the symbolism in these kinds of exchanges. It applies in societies that have traditionally based their economic system on these principles. So the exchange can't be too fast or too slow, right? If you take too long, same thing. What, did this person forget me? And the value of the gift, and we say gift here, it's not necessarily a gift like wrapped in a box with a bow, right? It can be food items, anything that people can exchange or give, essentially. And so the value isn't always monetary, it's culturally interpreted, again, with those armbands and necklaces, all right? Or think about, if you have a child in your life who gives you a craft that they made in school, especially for you, or you did that when you were a kid, right? It's not worth much financially, and we all know this. We all have items that maybe aren't worth very much. They might be dollar store, they might be homemade, but their value is much more emotional and cultural. Now, another kind of mode of exchange that anthropologists talk a lot about is redistribution. Now, redistribution, like the word kind of explains what it is in a way, because you gather resources in a central place, okay, and then you reallocate them throughout a community. So, this has been the dominant system in many societies over time, but locally, like even in capitalist societies, we see an example of that principle with the taxation system, right? So people pay taxes, not taxed, taxes to the government, and the government then redistributes this to the population through the building of roads, funding schools, hospitals, all these public services, right? So people complain about taxes sometimes, but that's essentially the way of managing these public services and making sure that society has what they need. Now, what's the risk? So in some small-scale societies, you've had this system in place that was, the entire economic system. Especially, you started to see this with, say, different kinds of agriculture that emerged. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And you might have a system where you have different plots of land in different spots, right? Throughout a society, and maybe people are growing different things. So rice, potatoes, carrots, whatever. And then, maybe they would kind of develop the system where one person or a group of people would gather the crops from all these different places in a central location. Right? So you're going around getting, rice from one place and potatoes from the other and carrots from the other and, whatever they're growing, bananas, right? And then the idea is to redistribute some of all of that to everybody. So if you're somebody who's working in an area where you're growing carrots, you're cultivating carrots, and that's your area of specialty, I'm overgeneralizing here, but it's just to explain the principle, right? So then you give your bananas, right? But then you're going to get back some bananas, you're going to get some rice, you're going to get some potatoes, you're going to get some carrots. So that's redistribution. Everybody gives to one central place, and everybody gets back a little bit of everything. There's a risk there, though, right? And again, when we do these little role plays in class with the poker chips, and we demonstrate, okay, this is how this works. Now, what's the risk? Well, the risk is that the people who are collecting this stuff in a central location might cheat the system and not give back as much and start to do some hoarding and keep more for their own families or give more to their families. Right? And that has happened, and that's why sometimes when we talk, like in a couple weeks ago when we talked about how hierarchies and class systems started to emerge with more intensive agriculture and larger societies, this is exactly what happened. Some people started hoarding and keeping more than others, and when you have larger populations, it's easier to do that because not everybody knows each other anymore. You don't have that sense of communal obligation in the same way that you do when you have a small population. So a lot of these differences between societies with economic disparities, rich and poor, or power relations happens because of larger numbers. When you have small scale societies, it's easy to keep a fair system of redistribution or generalized reciprocity or something like that. So in kind of societies where it has managed to work in a relatively fair way, it's because there are leveling mechanisms. And these are usually social mechanisms where there's going to be some way in which the people who wind up having more at some point are accountable to the others for redistributing. And there's political accountability, moral accountability, and people hold them to it. so that you might gain status by having gathered a bunch of stuff, and you're seen as kind of a person with prestige that is, is worthy of respect, but you only get to keep that respect if you actually give back, so that at the end everybody winds up having the same access to what they need to survive. Okay, so there's an example of this with the potlatch, and the textbook talks about this a little bit. So not to be confused with potlucks. This happens all the time in student papers. At the end they talk about potlucks. A potluck is not the potlatch, okay? Potluck is when you have a party and everybody, I don't know where the word comes from exactly, but everybody brings something, a dish to share at a party, right? Potlatch is different. Potlatch is a ceremonial tradition that's common among First Nations peoples of the West Coast in Canada, including the Noochka. I don't remember how to pronounce it. I've never heard it said, but you can read more about them in the textbook and the potlatch tradition there. But the Tlingit, the Kwakwaka'wakw, many First Nations along the West Coast have practiced this for time immemorial. And so how this would happen is chiefs, or in the textbook they say nobles, I guess it depends on the culture, but chiefs would have a lot of prestige, and they would gather a lot of things over the years, right? And they'd be seen as quite wealthy. So, but the leveling mechanism here to make sure that there was no development of classes like rich and poor was that they would have to keep their prestige, to be honorable, to make sure people kept respecting them. They'd have to host potlatch ceremonies where they would invite, people from all the different communities around, and they would redistribute everything that they had gathered over the year. Could be food items, could be blankets, could be, anything that's useful, right? And so then, as I say in the textbook, then, when chiefs would be visiting other potlatches by other chiefs, then they would bring stuff back to their communities and redistribute there as well. So it's people would wind up getting what they needed in the end. And then they start over, and this is a cycle, and so chiefs kind of, in a bid to prestige, maybe would try to outdo each other. Because the person who gives the most winds up having the most prestige. And at the end of the day, you're left with no more stuff than anybody else. Okay, so it's an interesting system because again it's a leveling mechanism to make sure that you don't wind up with a system where some people hoard at the expense of everybody else, as we're seeing in our society, right? And these events, again, as with the other things, they're not just economic. All right, it's really important to remember that. And I put a couple of videos here, so when you download these slides, you can click here. One is 1.5 minutes and the other is 2.5 minutes, and they're people from different Western First Nations, meaning First Nations on the West Coast, that also practice the potlatch, and they talk about some of the symbolism and some of the occasions for which they would have a potlatch, like the birth of a child, a wedding, a funeral, different things like that. So it's kind of interesting to learn about that, especially since it's unfortunately non-Indigenous people don't learn a lot about these traditions, and also potlatch and many other ceremonies that Indigenous people had as these kinds of social things that kept their societies together and healthy. They were banned in Canada for a long time, I think about a century, and so that's part of the colonial assimilation project that Canada had to try to wipe out Indigenous people in an act of genocide so they could take their land. So it's important to pay attention to this. So the third form of third mode of exchange that anthropologists talk about is market exchange. We're not going to go into as much depth in this one because you're pretty much all familiar with it because you live it if you live here. And it's something you learn a lot about in economics classes, right? So, as I say in a textbook, this is a form of a mode of exchange that emerged in capitalist society. The individual components of it existed before. So, because it's about trade, and trade has existed for a long time, way before market exchange. And currency has also existed way before market exchange, and markets as well, right? But it's just all of these three together and how they work together is very specific to the market exchange system of capitalist society. So there's trade, but instead of, say, trading, okay, this much lettuce for that many sheep, and you negotiate to see how much each thing is worth, it's based on a centralized kind of currency or money, right? And then there's the whole supply demand price issue, very complex stuff that, again, you learn about these things in your economics courses and how they work. So this particular combination, as the authors of our textbook point out, like I said, all three of these components existed before market exchange and before capitalism, but market exchange brings them together in a unique way that is tied in with the wider capitalist system and the social and political systems that go with that, the differences in power, the differences in wealth, the inequalities, right? And it goes also with a society that so individualism, sometimes at the cost of the health and well-being of some people. So we talked about modes of exchange in depth, so with reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. The other main topic that economic anthropology is concerned with is modes of production. Now, that actually comes before the exchange part, so I'm not sure why in the textbook they put it in this order, but I kind of went with it to help you keep things in the same order. So here we're talking about how a society organizes labor, and so what tools do people have access to do their work, what skills and knowledge do they need to do the work that they need to do, who does what, so the division of labor, and this obviously is related to modes of subsistence that we learned about. We talked about it at the beginning of video 1 and the beginning of this set of slides, but we talked about it subsistence in more depth a couple of weeks ago before the break, right? And so we know there are different modes of subsistence that exist, so from foraging to farming and so forth. So obviously the modes of production are directly related to the modes of subsistence. If you're foraging, which is gathering wild plants, fishing, hunting, then you don't need the same tools and skills as you do for farming. They're different skill sets, different tools, and the division of labor is going to look differently as well. It's also related to political organization, and that might sound like a stretch, but definitely, if you have a society that's egalitarian, and something that we're going to talk more in future weeks, but the principle of egalitarianism means that everybody has equal access to what they need to survive. You don't have this rich and poor, you don't have these differences in power, it's more consensus-based, and in these systems, usually organization of labor is also going to be fairly egalitarian, so that everybody's work is valued equally, even if the forms of work are different. Whereas when you start to have hierarchies and stratification, right, where you have people ranked in a certain way, then the kinds of work people even have access to is going to be different. So look at the society we live in. If you're born in a poor family, you can struggle and you can kind of wind up becoming a doctor or lawyer or something with a high pay, but it's going to be more difficult. You have less access to the training that you need to get to that level, right? And yeah, we have public schools, but they're not funded as well as private schools, right? And things like that. So, the quality is sometimes different, unfortunately, because the government doesn't invest as much in the public school system. So, you do wind up having this hierarchy and this stratification, and that affects the modes of production in terms of who's doing what kind of work, right? So there are three main types of modes of production that anthropologists talk about. There's kin-ordered, right? And this is where labor is organized along family lines, and that's very common among small-scale societies like foragers and small-scale farmers. It's like just the family all pitching in, and not just a nuclear family, right? We'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, family structures, but here we're talking about wider connections like extended families, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, all that. And generally, that makes sense in these small-scale societies where you do have an egalitarian system with not so much hierarchy, or maybe a little bit, right, but nothing extreme. Then you have the tributary mode of production where, this is when you hear about like the feudal system, which you learned about in like Western Civ and things like that, where, you have these rulers that kind of, take tributes from laborers in exchange for protection or just even access to the fields in the first place. And then here's where you're seeing like that heavier hierarchy and stratification. And then in the capitalist system, you have private property, private businesses that are owned by people of higher classes, so you have stratification there, and workers sell their labor, and what happens to that profit is completely out of control of the people who are actually doing the work, right? It's all in the hands of the people who own the property on which the work happens, or, and they, some of it will come back in wages, but most of it is kept by the people who own the means of production. So then the last topic is consumption. So what do we actually do with the things that we get? So that's the other main area of economic anthropology and economics in general as well. There's a lot of overlap there. But in anthropology, again, we look at this in a cross-cultural way, not just the Western system. So this might sound straightforward. Of course, you get food, you eat it, right? You get material to make shelter and clothing. Well, you make shelter and clothing, right? But what the kinds of questions anthropologists ask is to kind of try to understand, well, why does this look different in different places? So there are three factors to this, right? So in the textbook, they talk about Bronislaw Malinowski, who is an anthropologist he was a functionalist, right? So he would talk about how humans use the resources that they need: food, water, shelter, clothing, all this stuff. And he would look at it in terms of basic survival needs, so that kind of functionalist approach up here. So all humans have the same basic survival needs: nourishment, shelter, clothing, emotional bonding, all this kind of thing. So the resources that people get are used for those survival needs. It's just a very basic equation. But then you had other anthropologists who said, well, yeah, but it's not just about that. You can go around the world and see that people in different societies use things differently, to a different degree, or by different people and with different kinds of exchange. So it also has to do with what's available in the environment. And that's the position of cultural ecology, where the ways in which resources are obtained, but also the ways in which they're used, have a lot to do with what's available in a specific environment. So if you live in a high altitude, high up in the mountains, you're going to have different kinds of stuff, and you're going to use it differently than folks who are living in the forest or by the sea. So then that's all great, and both of these things are valid and very simple to understand, but then a lot of anthropologists say, yeah, but it still goes beyond that, because there are cultural values at play here and cultural logic that is specific or relative, right? Remember that concept, cultural relativism? Things make sense in their own culture, and there are different values in different cultures and different ways of thinking about what does it mean to be affluent, what does it mean to have a good life with having everything that you need. And they contrast, and I really encourage you to read this bit, because they go in more into detail about Chuhuansi life that we talked about earlier with the generalized reciprocity and all that. And they contrast that to capitalist systems. So in capitalist systems, to be affluent means to have a lot of stuff, more stuff than you actually need. You have your big house, maybe you also have a cottage out in the country, maybe you have 2 or 3 cars, one of them's fancy for special occasion, you have all the nice clothes, all the recent gadgets, all the stuff, right? And you don't actually need all this stuff, but capitalist systems promote high desire. So in capitalist cultures, things have symbolic and cultural value. You have a good life if you have a lot of stuff. Not every individual agrees, obviously, but these are the values that are promoted in capitalist system. Whereas with Chuhuansi people who, traditionally have been foragers and, semi-nomadic, move around a lot, within a territory, remember, nomadism doesn't mean you wander forever. I can't repeat that enough. But they didn't want or need a lot of stuff, and so their needs were more easily fulfilled because there were abundant food sources all around them all throughout the year. They knew where things were, and that guided their movements throughout their territory throughout the year, and they had plenty. In some seasons maybe they would have less of the stuff that they liked more, and they would have to eat some of the less desirable items, but there was still enough to get by, more than enough to get by. So it's different, right? Because on one hand you have a high desire and this constant need to produce more than what you need or require more than what you need as a society, and on the other hand it's like, well, we don't actually need that much, and if we're semi-nomadic and we're these small societies, we don't need a lot of big fancy things that we'd be stuck lugging around. It wouldn't make sense, it wouldn't be adaptive. So our needs are quite basic, but we have more than enough to fulfill those needs. So they're different ideas. So from a Western perspective, these folks would look very poor because they don't have a lot of things that are high in monetary value. But in their own worldview, they're very wealthy because they can just walk a little ways and have plenty of food for everybody. And it's actually not a lot of work. They say in the textbook that on average they would work maybe, I don't know, less than 4 days or something like that, right? So they have a lot more leisure time. So that's kind of a very quick overview. There's so much to cover and we can't cover it all, and this has already been 2 videos of 35 minutes each, and I suspect most of you won't have made it this far. So there's so much more we could talk about if we were in person and we had classes, but there you go. It is what it is. So again, if any of this is confusing, please don't be shy to let me know.